Chapter 1. Child's Play. Production on the first Child's Play began in 1988, and from what I've seen, there was already some frustration within the crew of the film before production really began. The script for the film was originally written by Don Mancini, who at the time was only 24, and had only worked on one film previously that also came out in 1988, Cellar Dweller. Originally called Blood Buddy, the film was more of a critique of advertising culture aimed at children. The basic build-up of the film was still there. Andy was still an only child, his mother worked too much, and his father wasn't in the picture. And people still began to show up dead in mysterious ways. The film would have lingered more on the mystery of the situation, and in all honesty, it probably would have been a slightly more interesting and stronger film than the one we ended up getting. Because it focused more heavily on the whodunit nature on if Andy was killing these people, or if we should believe Andy and think that his doll is murdering while no one is looking, and would have held on to that mystery for much longer than the actual film does. It is at this point in the story that two things happen that will continue to haunt the franchise, lingering over it even till this day. The first is the MGM bought the script to Blood Buddy from Don Mancini, creating a contract with him and producer David Kirshner that they retain partial rights to the characters and the film. This will come into play much later. The second is that MGM hired director Tom Holland, fresh off of the hit films Fright Night and Fatal Beauty, to direct what would eventually be called Child's Play, and rewrite the script with John Lafia. It was at this stage that Mancini lost a large portion of control over the film, which is a frequent and sad story of written works by young and inexperienced new writers, who have a hit idea. Similar to how the finished film of Less Than Zero bears next to no resemblance of the novel it is based on by Bret Easton Ellis, who was only 20 when he wrote it. Among the changes that Holland and Lafia brought to the script was the removal of most of the mystery on if Andy Barclay was killing people or if it was his doll, the inclusion of the voodoo magic in the film, the removal of the social commentary on the effect of advertising aimed at children, as well as the creation of the character Charles Lee Ray, the serial killer who was killed in the opening of the film, who uses the power of voodoo to put his soul into a good guy doll that would eventually become known as Chucky. And it's for all of these reasons that I don't think that the first Child's Play film works incredibly well as a standalone horror film. Too much of the screen time is wasted on a fake mystery that the adults are trying to solve that we as the audience know the answer to because we're shown that Chucky is implanted with the soul of a killer in the first scene of the film. I don't think it's a bad movie, and really it is a good first attempt, but in my opinion the film is more of a prototype of what Child's Play would be rather than what it actually is. There are some really great things in the movie. The practical effects here are absolutely outstanding, and they have aged really well. Mancini has stated that it wasn't until Gremlins was made that he felt like he really would have been able to make this movie the way that it should have been made because animatronic effects simply were not there yet. The movie actually does a lot of interesting things with their effects as well that I love, that the rest of the film's kind of abandoned probably for budgetary reasons. Because the goal of Chucky in this film is to use voodoo magic to transfer his soul to the body of a child so that he can live again as a human, the production staff came up with the interesting idea of having Chucky slowly become more human-looking throughout the film, as his doll body turns to flesh slowly as an effect of the magic. So in the beginning of the film, he resembles a Cabbage Patch doll or a My Buddy doll, both of which were the main influences for his look, and by the end of the film, his skin has a much more fleshy look to it, complete with blemishes, bruises, and unkempt eyebrows. The film also preemptively fixed a problem that the rest of the films in the franchise would go on to have as well, in that they made Chucky feel solid. In most of the other films, when Chucky or any of the other dolls are walking or running, and their full body is in the frame, they have this strange floating look to them. Like they're just hovering above the ground and their legs are just moving to give the illusion that they're actually touching the ground. But in the first Child's Play, they actually used forced perspective to give the illusion in a few shots that Chucky is a real and physical threat, and I love that. By placing the actor who portrays Andy closer to the camera, and using extra large sets, they were able to have little people and child actors dressed up as Chucky for some of the shots that give a great effect that he is actually in the room and could actually harm Andy. And since it is from the perspective of Andy, the child, the strange proportions of the room don't look so off. This shot right here of Chucky looming over Andy with the knife in the hallway is easily one of my favorite shots in the entire franchise. And it's because he's an actual physical presence, and I think that it adds a lot to the film. Child's Play went on to become a massive success, earning $44 million on a $9 million budget, so Universal Artists, owned by MGM, greenlit a second film. But before filming could begin, Universal Artists was sold to the now defunct financial services company Quintex, who didn't have interest in making horror films and canceled the project. Producer David Kirshner and writer Don Mancini were bombarded by offers from almost every major studio to purchase their part in the rights to Child's Play to make a second film. But it wasn't until Steven Spielberg stepped in that they decided what to do with the franchise. He advised them to make a list of demands for the film, and to present the list to Universal first, the company that had made his career and the one that he had the most clout with. I assume that Spielberg had affinity for the first film, and the franchise in general, because arguably, the best part of his most recent film was a Chucky cameo nearly 30 years after advising Kirshner and Mancini on what to do in the situation. Universal bought the film, Kirshner and Mancini were able to hold on to their rights, and the film immediately went into production. Child's Play 2 is a fantastic movie, and along with Curse of Chucky, I think it is the peak Child's Play experience. This is, to me, where the franchise hits one of the highest peaks, and it is here that a lot of my favorite tropes of the series are put into place. The film starts out with the restoration of the good guy doll containing the soul of Charles Lee Ray, after being burned at the end of the last film. It is such a good opening that the next 3 films in the franchise would reference it with their own openings as well, but to me, none of them quite live up to this one. This film also starts the trend of each film having a large set piece for an ending that I'll get to in a moment. And really the only major trope of the series that isn't established in this film is Chucky wanting to transfer his soul to a human child host, as well as Chucky losing an arm in the climax of almost every film. The first half of the movie covers Andy after the events of the first film. His mother has gone crazy after the incident and is locked away in an institution never to return physically to the franchise, although Andy does talk to her at one point on the phone in a later film. My guess is that Catherine Hicks didn't want to return out of fear of becoming a scream queen that would hurt her acting career in the long run. And she probably made the right decision, as she went on to have a really lucrative television career, such as starring in over 200 episodes of the WB's Seventh Heaven, and being the human face of the Child's Play series may have jeopardized jobs like that for her, so I don't blame her. So instead here, Andy is sent into the foster system and goes to live with the Simpson family to try and recover from the events with Chucky in Chicago. The first half of the movie is good, but it really just serves as a setup for the amazing second half after Chucky breaks loose after being remade by the toy company, trying to find defects in his system that would have led to him causing the deaths of several people. The first half does have some standout moments though. Twin Peaks' Grace Zabriskie appears as the social worker, and it's always a treat to see her in anything. The last half, however, is a giant set piece. It takes place in the Play Pals toy company factory that produces the good guy dolls. Chucky chases Andy and Kyle, another child in the foster program, to the toy company with the intention of secluding Andy to again try and take over his body through the use of voodoo. This sequence is masterful. There is always something to look at in the background, but it's never distracting, and it's easily one of the best sequences to come out of all of the 80s slasher film franchises. It references other great scenes from horror that decade, such as just completely recreating the hedge chase scene from The Shining, except replacing the hedges with thousands of good guy doll packages. You never know where Chucky might be hiding, because there's a ton of good guy dolls everywhere, and it is a really smart way to hide a slasher villain and make him scary. And this movie is scary, which is one of its best draws. I honestly do like every film in the franchise, and I love a few of them, but there are only 2 films in there that are actually able to make a talking doll scary to me, and this is one of them. Child's Play 2 did well in theaters, but not as well as the first one had, and to quickly make a return on their investments, Universal made a decision that would begin a low point of the franchise and ordered another film in the series to be made, and set the release date only 9 months after the release of the second film, so that audiences wouldn't lose interest. This forced Mancini to begin the screenplay for 3 only a short while after finishing the screenplay for 2, and in his opinion he felt like he didn't have enough time in between the projects, and didn't have enough good ideas, and honestly it kinda shows. Child's Play 3 isn't a bad movie per se, but it's a really tired feeling movie. Everything in there is a trope. Every character would be able to be assigned to a TV tropes page really easily, and everything in it down to the setting feels like it was taken from a template. The movie does do something interesting that wasn't common for horror franchises at the time, and that it takes a giant leap forward in time and actually takes place in the future. Andy, now 16, has been transferred to a prestigious military academy. There he befriends the stereotypically nerdy kid trope who doesn't want to be there but is forced by his parents, and the girl that everyone underestimates at first but then proves to be better at all the physical things than the boys trope, and their adversary is the older masculine kid who has an in with the school and can do whatever he wants trope. It isn't bad, but it isn't great either. And if I had to describe the movie with just one word, it would be watchable. It is here also that the series starts to show its age, even though at the time it was just a few years old. Chucky is resurrected and rebuilt again when the Play Pals company decides that it has been enough time since the past events that they can start making good guy dolls again. They scrape the deformed mask that had once been Chucky off the floor after he'd been melted at the end of part 2, and in the process they accidentally pour some of his blood into a vat of plastic, bringing him back to life. Remember that part, because it'll be really important later on in the video. Chucky finds out where Andy is now in life, and ships himself to the military academy, to seek revenge for killing him in 2 movies in a row. This isn't his only motivation though, as he once again tries to find a human host to put his soul into. I think that this is the most trying plotline through the entire franchise, and it comes as a direct result of Tom Holland and John Lafia being hired to rewrite the first film. Voodoo was never a part of Mancini's original concept for the first movie. It wasn't his idea, and I don't think that he liked it. And as a result of this, every time the idea of voodoo comes up in the franchise, it is treated more and more as a joke. I think Mancini legitimately tried to work with it in the films originally, like in part 2, but by the time he gets to Bride of Chucky, characters are looking things up in Voodoo for Dummies, and it just makes me wish that if he didn't like the idea, he would have found some way to write it out of the story. Because once again here, Chucky has the same motivation to take over a human body that he will also have in the next 2 films, as well as partially the most recent film. And I really wish that Chucky would have just decided in-universe to become a killer doll a lot sooner, because that to me is a much more interesting angle than having him try to abduct the bodies of children in film after film and failing time after time. And I guess at this time is where we should talk about tone, and where slashers were at the time that this movie was made. I plan on covering this more in depth in a future video, but to cut to the chase, after the golden age of slashers ended in 1984, the general public was kind of upset at the level of violence that was present in those films. As a result, slashers evolved to incorporate the paranormal to make them less realistic, resulting in characters like Jason and Michael Myers becoming supernatural, and the creation of new characters like Chucky, Freddy Krueger, Candyman, and the Leprechaun becoming the second generation of slasher icons. The first 2 films in the series fall in line with what other films at the time felt like, but part 3 really feels like a bridge movie in between styles. And really to enjoy it more, you kinda have to see it as an adult's version of a kid's horror, because honestly the strange tone of this movie makes it feel like a weird, graphic episode of Goosebumps. The campiness in here actually makes it have a lot of similarities to the Goosebumps episode, The Perfect School. It has a similar cheap score, similar weird acting decisions, and the setting as well, and it kinda goes to show how each film in the franchise really does represent aspects of what horror was at that time. Similar to how the next 2 movies would feel like a combination of Scream, Scary Movie, and the live-action Scooby-Doo during the deconstructionist time of horror. The movie isn't all bad, but it is both Don Mancini and Brad Dourif's least favorite entry into the series. In fact, I feel the way that Chucky moves in this film is probably the best that he does in the entire franchise. This was the first film that used a computer to map out his puppeteering, making his actions seem really smooth and lifelike, and I really like that about it. The end sequence is really cool too, taking place in a haunted house roller coaster, where Andy and the other characters are trying on foot to dodge cars while hiding from Chucky. But overall, this movie was dead on arrival. It made substantially less money than the other 2 films had, and within a year the series was struck with controversy after 2 horrible crimes. In December of 1992, Susan Clapper was abducted by 4 individuals claiming to be influenced by the film, who tortured her over the course of several days before burning her to death in a field outside of Manchester. And in February 1993, 2 teenagers kidnapped 2-year-old James Bulger and tortured him to death as well, inciting Child's Play 3 as the biggest inspiration to their crimes. And so, Universal shelved the franchise, and to this day there has yet to be another film in the series that has starred a child. Chapter 2. The Family of Chucky. The opening moments of The Bride of Chucky tell you exactly what kind of movie it's gonna be. An officer goes through an evidence locker that is lit in all blue, that is shot primarily in Dutch tilts. Rain splashes the window and lightning flickers to reveal Jason and Michael Myers' masks. Freddy's glove, Leatherface's chainsaw. The officer walks past this though, to grab a bag that he brings outside to Jennifer Tilly, decked out in black lipstick and fishnets. She kills him and looks inside the bag to find Chucky's head. Oh, and Rob Zombie's also playing in the background. This isn't a movie that's aged very well. I know a lot of people love this movie, but for me it is easily the low point of the franchise, which I think for a lot of people that would be kind of shocking because that mantle is traditionally presented to the seat of Chucky, but we'll get to that. The movie just doesn't do it for me overall. It has enough in it that's good to where I can say that, but on the other hand, there's enough in the movie that just doesn't work for me to confidently say that this is my least favorite. And it isn't that it's silly. I love silly things, and my favorite parts of this movie are the parts that are really funny. And the funny parts are really the parts of the movie that work the best because they deliver fully on the experience of what horror comedy should be. I think this and Seed of Chucky are where Brad Dourif shines the most as an actor as well because he's allowed to just go there and get weird with it. Jennifer Tilly is great too, and the sex scene between them in doll form is honestly really great and iconic. But those moments for me don't hide the fact that this movie overall feels like a Child's Play version of Batman Forever, or as I said earlier, the live-action Scooby-Doo. It has that strange 90s visual style, combined with weird editing decisions and strange, dated music choices, that really signify a particular 5 or 6 year period of blockbuster film that is kind of hard to define. The main problem in the movie starts with a massive retcon, the heart of Damballa. After Chucky is brought back and his girlfriend Tiffany is transformed into a doll as well, they decide that they need to find human hosts to transfer themselves into, again. The only problem being is that they need the Heart of Damballa, a mystical amulet that allows the wearer to transfer souls into other bodies. They show a doctored image from the first film of Charles Lee Ray's body with the amulet around his neck, and it is revealed that he was buried wearing it. Getting the amulet back from the grave becomes the MacGuffin of this film, but it doesn't make sense. Chucky didn't have the amulet in part 2 or 3, but in those movies he can do voodoo magic just fine. I mean, he's always interrupted and fails in his attempts, but it is implied through the fact that he can conjure storms during his chant that he can in fact do soul transferring magic without the amulet if he weren't stopped in the process. So the very basis of the movie doesn't make sense from the beginning. I don't like the human characters, they don't act like real people at all, although I do like seeing John Ritter again, but overall it's a really troubled movie and it comes down to the fact that on the human side it takes itself too seriously. But there's a lot going on that I do like, such as Chucky's new design. The stitching looks cool and it's a good update to the character that allows him to change over time, and later will make continuity easier to visually signify. But I don't like that he doesn't move a lot in the film. Most of the movies have a lot of scenes where Chucky walks around and stands, but in this movie he's sitting down almost the entire time. Which is strange because this movie has easily the largest budget out of all of the Child's Play films, which means that his movements should look the best here, and that's sadly not on display. I mean, the puppetry's fine, on par with the other films, but the fact that he's sitting and doesn't move around in almost every scene is really strange and makes me wonder what the large budget was spent on, which I suspect a large part of it was wasted on the licensing for the music that was contemporary at the time but distracting today. Tiffany is a great character, and bounces well off of Chucky in conversations, and Jennifer Tilly is a great choice to voice her. And I'm genuinely glad that this movie was made if just for her to be a character that the series can rely on in future installments. She really is one of the best elements of the franchise and serves as a Harley Quinn bad girl crazy archetype that's really cool to see. The film did well, grossed $50 million at the box office, but for some reason that's hard to uncover, the next film wasn't made until 6 years later. I feel like this time in the 90s was one of the times that Chucky was at his peak. I remember being a kid and seeing Chucky merchandise in a lot of places like Spencer's, and so I don't really know why the film series took a 6-year break, but it did, and in 2004 we received Seed of Chucky. The previous film ended with a cliffhanger, in which a detective is inspecting the burned and mutilated corpse of Tiffany when she suddenly gives post-mortem birth to the result of the glorious plastic love scene that leaps through the air and presumably kills the inspector as we cut to black. The film continues on this ludicrous idea. Honestly, Seed of Chucky is one of my favorite movies in the franchise, and I consider it to be up there with Tucker and Dale vs. Evil in the pantheon of horror comedies. This movie is just so stupid that it is incredibly fun because the filmmakers dive in fully on the ridiculous nature of the concept that they were slightly conservative with in Bride of Chucky. What we get here is a domestic drama about a genderqueer child and their murderous parents, who all happen to be dolls that are living in the house of actress Jennifer Tilly without her knowing. And it is really, really fun and stupid and offensive, and the filmmakers know this and embrace it fully, and that's why it works. Seriously, if you consider it as its own thing and not attached to a well-known horror franchise, then there's a lot here that works. Jennifer Tilly is by far the best part of the movie as well. Here she plays two characters, herself and the doll Tiffany, who has been reincarnated into another copy of the same model of doll and is trying to take over Jennifer Tilly's body. It's really silly, a little complicated, but pretty much just boils down to Tilly making fun of herself for an hour and a half, and it's really, really funny. I haven't really seen a performer like this lampoon themselves so hard for an entire film, but I'm really glad that she just goes there, because the movie is a lot stronger because of her and the work that she does here. There's only one thing that was planned for this film that didn't turn out that would have made it even better. The role that Redman plays in the film is a big Hollywood director who's making a film about the Virgin Mary that Jennifer Tilly is going to star in. They get close in the pre-production of this movie within a movie, and start a relationship, turning him into the main male character of the film. This role, however, was originally intended to be written for Quentin Tarantino, who I think was interested and was going to play himself in the film, but for some reason Tarantino pulled out, and Redman was hired to replace him in it. I suspect, though, that the reason he left was because of the troubled production, as he isn't opposed to playing a satirized version of himself in movies.
And they just tear it up!
The film takes place in Los Angeles, and was going to film in Los Angeles, and would have been really convenient for him to be in it. But the team had trouble securing a large budget for the film, as each entry kept getting less and less in profits, and so the production was moved to Romania to take advantage of tax benefits. And I imagine it was at this stage that he left production. On the technical side, this film does a lot of stuff really nicely as well, despite the constraints placed on it. The entire opening is in the first-person perspective of Glenn before we even see him, and it really works. I'm actually surprised that it took them until the 5th film in the series to do a prolonged sequence from the perspective of the dolls, but I'm glad they finally did it because it's the second best opening in the series after 2. They also do a really good job making Romania look like California, which I imagine wasn't really an easy task. But a lot of the jokes in the film wouldn't play today, and do come off as a little mean-spirited, like Glenn thinking his family is Japanese because of a Made in Japan logo on them, and because of that he speaks Japanese and knows Kung Fu. Or the running joke of Glenn's gender dysmorphia brought on by Chucky wanting him to be a boy and Tiffany wanting him to be a girl, and his confusion over the whole thing because at first he identifies as a boy before he questions how strange it is that he is like a Ken doll and has no genitals at all. But then the absurdity of the situation dawns on you that you're trying to read thematically into a movie about the family problems of killer dolls that has John Waters in it, and it just becomes funny again. To me, the movie works. But I realize that I'm an outlier in this, as the average Chucky fan I've seen dislikes the movie. I think the general consensus is that most think it's trash, judging off its 4.9 score on IMDb, and unfortunately that was represented at the box office as well, where it really matters. Because the film made very little when it was first released, and the franchise sat on the shelf for almost an entire decade after that. Chapter 3. The Cult of Chucky. In 2013, Curse of Chucky was released direct-to-video on demand, DVD, and Blu-ray, and I think that's a giant shame. Because this film represents what Child's Play and the character of Chucky can be at its best. Curse of Chucky is by far the best film in the franchise, and it takes inspiration from a lot of unexpected places. It kind of feels like the love child of the tropes of Flannery O'Connor and the feelings of Shirley Jackson, built around the concept of a killer doll, which on the surface is a really strange idea that would have been really easy to mess up because on paper it sounds like a really bad idea. But Mancini's actually able to pull it off really, really well in an impressive way. The film starts off with Nika, played by Fiona Dourif, daughter of Brad Dourif, who is a paraplegic. She lives in an old giant house passed down by her family with her mother Sarah, whose mind is failing her and spends her days painting flowers. A man comes to the door and delivers a package, and he flirts with Nika. You can tell that he thinks that she's pretty, but as the two are getting to know each other, Sarah comes to the door and scolds him, scaring him off of the property. Sarah then tells Nika that he was being disingenuous, that he pitied her because she was in a wheelchair, and that's why he was nice to her. And then they continue with their own mundane activities, separate, by themselves, going about their lives in the big house alone. That night, Sarah commits suicide. The opening 5 minutes is masterful in its effective storytelling. With the details that we're given, we can tell exactly what the past 30 years has been like for both of these characters. We know who they are, how they feel about themselves and each other, and what their situation in life is from one scene that isn't directly about any of that, which just goes to show how well written this script is. And the images that are brought about conjure the same agoraphobic feelings that classic stories like Good Country People and We Have Always Lived in the Castle are built on. Curse of Chucky, in its own strange way, is an amazing Southern Gothic horror that should be seen as a legitimately good work of horror fiction, and respected for what it does in the way that it builds character and tension. The film is amazing for what it does within the frame of the Southern Gothic tale. Each character has a secret to tell, hides behind a mask, and they each have their own alternative motive and grudges that they hold against other members of the cast. After Sarah's suicide, the relatives come to the house for the funeral, and the decision has to be reached about what to do with the large house that Nika has lived in her whole life, because they've each inherited a portion of the home. They have a tense conversation about it, and Nika leaves to cook dinner. And when she isn't looking, rat poison is mixed into just one of the bowls of soup that she prepares. And we are forced to watch a scene that goes on for an agonizing length of time, while the group eats dinner, knowing that one of them is probably about to spit blood all over the table at any moment, but not knowing which one it's going to be. Chucky doesn't even come alive in this movie until nearly 50 minutes into it. He just sits and watches as the family crumbles apart around him in deep-cut generational trauma, and is never suspected for the things happening, making it the first in 6 movies that has rational people that don't immediately suspect that the doll is actually killing people until he reveals himself. And just further goes to show how intelligent the script for this film is. During this time that Chucky isn't doing anything but sit and watch people blame each other for killings they didn't do is when my favorite shot of the franchise happens, and in my opinion the scariest moment in any of the films. When Alice, the young daughter of Nika's sister, picks up Chucky, who at this point still hasn't revealed himself, and gives him a big hug, all that we see are the pupils of his eyes dilating. Chucky's eyes are actually a feature in almost every movie and are really a big part of building the horror and uncanniness of him. In the second film, we see them being pushed into his weirdly fleshy but still rubbery face by an industrial machine, but it's in this movie that his eyes do the most work, because even though he looks like a doll, when the camera is close to him, the eyes are so realistic that it gives an extremely uncomfortable feeling that I don't enjoy looking at. Even though he doesn't move for most of the film, once he does come alive, Chucky is at his best here. It can't be said enough how much the vocal performance of Brad Dourif helps all of these movies. He is amazing in the role, and the way that he's able to change and adapt for each film depending on what tone they are calling for in an appropriate way is really impressive and really what makes Chucky stand out on his own. Slasher and horror franchise villains that are able to hold on to the same performer for long periods of time have always been my favorites, and I always feel more attached to these villains than I do others that change actors in almost every film. So I just wanted to say here that I really appreciate Brad Dourif staying with the character for so long, and the work that he does here in Curse of Chucky is some of his best. He even gets a prolonged flashback under heavy makeup playing Charles Lee Ray in the days leading up to his death nearly 30 years prior, and is able to stretch even more as an actor there. And so, all of this brings me to the point that it is a massive shame that this film was released direct to DVD and Blu-ray. By not releasing this film theatrically, Universal effectively killed it, and it makes me feel like Curse of Chucky was made a few years too early. The film is certainly good enough to be distributed theatrically, even though its budget was rather small, but the model for releasing horror films has changed a lot since 2013, and Universal has since learned that releasing cheaper-made horror films to theatrical audiences can yield massive profits, through their partnership in distributing films like Get Out, Happy Death Day, and Halloween with Blumhouse. And if Curse of Chucky had been made today, then I think it probably wouldn't have been treated the same way that it was, which is a shame, because as a result, the film was for the most part only seen by die-hard Child's Play and horror fans. Curse of Chucky does do something though that, while not bad here, would quickly turn into a negative aspect for the franchise, in that Curse of Chucky is really the first film in the franchise that really cares about continuity. Caring about continuity isn't a bad thing in itself. In fact, most film franchises really should care about it, but waiting until the 6th film to start playing with lore is a risky move that Curse handles fairly well. There are light callbacks in the film that are fun and harmless, such as the elevator in the house representing the elevator in the first film, and Nika reading about events in the previous films online. But there are other things, like the stitching on Chucky's head being revealed midway through the film, confirming that both Bride and Seed of Chucky are both canon, which isn't bad on the surface. But it makes you start to ask questions that you didn't ask before. Like, how did Chucky come back after being dismembered at the end of Seed of Chucky? By his family? Did they bring him back? If so, why? And if that is canon, he clearly bleeds when his head is cut off at the end of that film, so why doesn't it here? What are Tiffany and Glenn doing now? And so on. Those questions don't pop in your head while watching the other films, because each of these movies has a fairly loose canon that doesn't flash in your face constantly that the other movies happened. But here, we are constantly reminded from the halfway point on that this is a large universe, and that there are rules and a history, and by doing this constantly, it contradicts itself by evidence from previous films. But all of this is kind of minor here, and I don't want to speak ill of Curse too much because it really is a wonderful film. But in setting up the precedent that canon is crucial, it really set a difficult path for the next entry in the franchise to follow, 2017's Cult of Chucky. This film relies on one gimmick, and if that gimmick doesn't work for you, then you're gonna have a bad time. Because this is the film that tries to bring in almost every element from the previous films all together in one giant epic tale that wasn't originally planned to be told. So it had to be cobbled together with mixed results. It isn't bad, but I think that it was a misguided place to take the franchise after an excellent soft reboot that brought the series back to its horror roots. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of the film, I do still like it, and it's really fun. Pretty much every film in the series is touched here, and each of the major players in the series is either mentioned or makes an appearance, except for Glenn. I could see this being a fun idea in theory, and it's nice to see these things coming together in a sort of 30th anniversary celebration of the series. I like that it is truly a film that is designed to be seen by only people who are fans of the franchise, but overall, the idea should have been worked a bit before filming. The idea revolves around Nika, who has been institutionalized after a breakdown that resulted from the events of the last film, and Chucky coming to the hospital to kill her, and the actor who played Andy in the first two films, now grown, trying to save her. Tiffany makes an appearance, both in doll form as well as in the body of actress Jennifer Tilly, and overall it's fun, but the more outlandish things from the previous films clash when brought into the grim universe that Curse and Cult try to create. The main problem comes from the idea that there are multiple Chuckies in this film and multiple good guy dolls, forming the cult of Chucky. As prior to the film beginning, he learns a new voodoo spell to split his soul into parts to put him in different bodies. I knew going in that this was the first entry to explore the idea of multiple Chuckies being created and existing, an idea going back to Child's Play 3 that was scrapped over the lack of funding to do it well. And I was really excited in the lead up to this film to see how it would be handled, and in a way, I feel kind of betrayed for caring, because the use of a new voodoo spell that he literally learns on voodooForDummies.com is the most lazy way that plotline could have been introduced. Remember back when we were talking about Part 3, and I said to remember Chucky's blood pouring into the plastic, creating a new Chucky after they scraped his dead body off the ground? Well, I was sure that was how they were going to justify the multiple Chuckies in this film. They had a way out, in the movie obsessed with continuity, to already explain the main villain being able to split himself by using evidence directly from a previous entry into the franchise, and they didn't use it. And at the time it was really upsetting to me, because right here I can take ideas that they wanted to explore and explain them better using in-universe logic than they bothered to in the actual film that cost millions of dollars to make. And it could have been so cool too. You could have the different Chuckies who died from all the different films coming back and each one having their own motive and grudge instead of each essentially being the same person. If they wanted to make a horror epic that was based on 30 years of continuity, then they should have gone fully in on the idea and used pre-established lore and not used lazy cop-outs to explain how it was all happening. And this isn't the case of one writer not liking the decisions another writer in the franchise took with their turn at the helm, because Don Mancini literally wrote all of the movies and directed close to half of them. And I'm not trying to be a dick here. I'm really not. Because what he was able to achieve with this franchise over the course of 30 years is more than just about anyone in horror has by themselves. Child's Play, Phantasm, and Romero's Dead movies are unique in being some of the only big, long-lasting horror franchises with one creative vision behind them. Most people can't say that, but when Curse of Chucky was so good, and so well thought out, and so well cared for in every detail, it is just upsetting when major plot points are explained away with voodoo'sfordummies.com. It is insulting to the audience and is a bitter capstone to an excellent series. There are other issues here that we don't have to go into as much. I personally don't like the insane asylum setting for horror, as to me it feels mean-spirited and takes humor out of people who can't help their situation in life, and I don't like that. It feels devoid of human compassion to make people who are already othered to bear the burden of more stigma for our entertainment. But it is so common in horror that it is more of a genre problem than a Cult of Chucky problem. The film falls into absolute nonsense by the end of it, which is unfortunate. It's hard to actually tell what they were going for with this ending, other than setting up the stakes for the next installment of the series, and it does some really strange things. Like when Chucky wins at the end of the film and takes over Nika's body, forcing her to join the cult, her body can now walk? No one really comments on this, and I guess we're just supposed to take it as magic. Did magic fix her spine? If so, by that logic, can Chucky raise the dead and occupy those bodies? It opens up too many questions because this film has no hard and set rules like the first ones had. In the original trilogy, there was one spell, and we as the audience knew how it worked, and thus we knew the stakes that were at play. And so you can see from that one explanation earlier of how Chucky learned the new spell, everything in the story starts to unravel around itself because there aren't set rules. And without that basic tenet of writing, everything becomes weaker as a result. And the only reason I harp on this is based on the other entries before this. Mancini knows this kind of stuff really well. He has written some great films, and overall I love this series. If I didn't, I certainly wouldn't take 2 weeks making a nearly 40-minute video about it. But here he just sort of throws all that out the window and picks up some of the more lazy things that horror is known for, and as a fan I did not like to see that happen. The film was a moderate success on the video market, and with that, Don Mancini announced his plans for the next entry into the Child's Play series to be a television event, somewhat in the style of Ash vs. the Evil Dead, and in doing so, led us to today, where we are currently in the midst of the most interesting time in the franchise's 30-year history. Chapter 4. The Two Chuckies. So, remember back near the beginning of the video, when I said that MGM signed a contract when buying the script for Blood Buddies, in which David Kirshner and Don Mancini held onto the shared rights of the character Chucky as well as the first Child's Play film with MGM? Well, since old horror is coming back in a big way with Blumhouse and the recent success of Halloween, and their recent development in bringing back the Universal monsters, and the rumor that other slasher giants are coming back to the big screen as well, MGM decided they wanted a slice of that. And so, as you probably know, this summer we're getting a reboot of the original film, called Child's Play, starring Aubrey Plaza as Andy's mother Karen, that doesn't involve anyone involved with the original deal, except for MGM. They have released a few teaser images and a poster for the film, but they've been playing really coy with a few details, implying that there won't be voodoo in this version of the story, and that Brad Dourif won't be reprising his role as Chucky. They haven't even confirmed that the doll's name is going to be Chucky in this version, which makes me wonder if Mancini holds the rights exclusively to that name, or if they're waiting for the big reveal of the new Chucky in the trailer, which is expected to come soon. Mancini's production, on the other hand, is still developing the follow-up to Cult of Chucky that will expand on the semi-cliffhanger ending in that film that suggests a much larger film to come. It's still slated to be made, and just this week the Sci-Fi Network landed the show and will air it probably sometime in the next year. And so we're currently paused at the gates of a future in which the Child's Play franchise is going to be split in two, presumably taking two extremely different directions, somewhat similar to Romero's zombie films and the Return of the Living Dead series splitting off of Night of the Living Dead. I don't know how either of these are going to pan out, but there are aspects of both of them that makes me extremely excited. I'm curious to see the direction that the new film takes. I am just as curious to see how Mancini treats the show, considering he isn't opposed to taking the characters frequently in wildly different directions than they'd been before. And I am hopeful that one of them takes advantages in recent developments in animatronic technology developed mainly for theme parks. Because seeing a return to that style for horror movies using modern advancements would really be something to see. And I think if there is one way for either series to grow, it's through that avenue. I'm sure that Mancini isn't very happy about the new film, nor would most fans of the series, I imagine. But that's how these franchises go. And that is why I like to study them, because horror franchise filmmaking is the art of catching the ball and running with it, taking what is already there and expanding on it, making something fresh out of things that were already there before you. There aren't many major horror franchises today that have gone unscathed by hands that weren't involved in the original film, but franchises like this are built on the potential of what future films are able to do, and a lot of the times it yields trash, but many other times greatness is achieved, and I for one am really excited for the coming year. Because in this game, nothing ever ends, nothing stays dead, and if it has to come back, then I'm excited and at least hopeful for both sides to see what they do with the good guy dolls.